A warning, our next story discusses suicide and contains distressing details. The suicide of a 10-year-old Indigenous boy who was in state care in Western Australia has been called an unspeakable tragedy. The boy was in child protection, living with another family member when he took his own life on Saturday night. Associate Professor and Noongar human rights academic Hannah McGlade spoke with the ABC's Dan Borscher earlier. She says the news has rocked Indigenous communities.
Just so wrong, just so terrible. And of course, we feel that could this child's death have been prevented? We know that he was in out of home care, had been removed from his parents, hadn't seen his parents for some time. So it is very worrying, and of course we're heartbroken. There's many Aboriginal youth here at the UN Permanent Forum for Indigenous Issues, focusing on youth issues. We're very shocked and saddened.
Yeah, and that's certainly the sense that I've been hearing and seeing across Australia, and people really trying to grapple with what this means. Someone so young dying by suicide. This is in part the area that you spend a lot of your time advocating and researching. How have you grappled with this?
We believe that the child protection systems have continued a colonial history of assimilation that hasn't been properly addressed. Although we've had reforms, we don't think that they're adequate. And we believe fully, that Aboriginal children are being extremely traumatised and harmed actually from the child protection systems and the removal of children from their families. So that is our understanding, and we want to improve this situation using our knowledge as Indigenous peoples of the importance of family and culture, the importance of prevention, early intervention and Aboriginal healing, and of course the significance of human rights principles and standards, including self-determination in out-of-home care.
And in fact, you've been calling for these kinds of reforms for a very long time. You've just written recently that what we are seeing is very slow, and that doesn't go as far as it needs to in terms of systemic or structural reform. Why do you think that is?
Well, we haven't really implemented the recommendations of the important human rights inquiry, bringing them home some 20 years ago, a national inquiry into the history of the stolen generations, but also looking at the then current practices in child removal and calling for Aboriginal self-determination in this area in child protection. We saw in Victoria that the jurisdiction has now been transferred to the Aboriginal community, but that hasn't happened. In Western Australia, we don't see best practice in our laws, particularly including the right of family to be involved in decisions. And these really significant decisions about removing children based on actual risk or perceived risk as determined by child protection officers really need to be made by Aboriginal people properly informed of the situation and without the issue of racial bias.
And you mentioned about the Bringing Them Home report, and in fact now, all these decades on, there are Aboriginal children make up 35% of children in care. That was around 20% when that report came out. So in the decades since, the number of Aboriginal children in care has almost doubled.
Yes, we have a real issue with addressing human rights violations and our severe history of human rights violations from the way our country was founded on violence and unlawful in the fact that Indigenous people's rights were not recognised without treaty. We've really been tackling these issues for so long. We haven't had a national truth-telling process. We don't have a national Indigenous voice. We were defeated at a referendum only last year. And this does explain why we're not making the progress. The National Aboriginal Children's Body, SNAKE, has been campaigning for reduction, addressing Aboriginal children's overrepresentation for many years now in the Family Matters campaign. Unfortunately, the advice is often not listened to in our state. Key stakeholders, Aboriginal in the state and wider non-Aboriginal, joined us in an open letter to the West Australian government some years ago concerning the reform laws, that they really didn't protect the rights and interests of Aboriginal children and families. We're really also concerned about the need to increase investment into early intervention and prevention. The Bringing Them Home inquiry made it clear that what happened in Australia was a form of genocide against Indigenous people, and there are ramifications and intergenerational impacts of that, as well as systemic racism and discrimination today, and we really haven't grappled with it.
And Dr. McGlade, you've been touching there on that particular report, Bringing Them Home. There are also recommendations that remain incomplete from the Royal Commission into Aboriginal deaths in custody, even earlier than that, in the early 90s. And there have been a litany of other reports since then. Is it the case now that governments of all persuasions in states, territories and the Commonwealth need to go back to looking at those reports, or is there some sort of new review that is required to deeply understand what is happening right now?
I support the call of the National Children's Commissioner, Anne Hollands, for a youth justice task force to address the issue of children incarcerated. In terms of Indigenous children removed by the state, we know that many then become subsequently interacting with the criminal justice system as well. I do think we need to go back to the drawing board. The Closing the Gap national policy has shown that child removals, incarceration and suicide are all increasing. So these are very significant issues. We need to use our best minds and knowledge to address this situation. I have to report that Australia at this point is not really engaging with the human rights of children, Indigenous children particularly. We signed the Convention on the Rights of the Child in 1990, I believe, but to this day we have refused to sign the optional protocol attached to this convention, and that instrument would allow children whose rights are violated to take their communication to the UN committee and to seek a decision from the committee. And this is an issue of international human rights law pertaining to children. And we also indicated that we won't be bound by a prohibition in the Convention on cruel, inhumane treatment of children incarcerated, and the requirement that children are never incarcerated in adult prisons. What we're seeing really here is a lack of respect and commitment to the rights of Indigenous children from the uppermost levels. And that is something that certainly does need to be tackled and addressed very soon.
And just finally, Dr. McGlade, what's at stake if there isn't an addressing of these issues soon?
We are seeing Aboriginal children die as a result of violence and inhumane, cruel practices from the state. So we're losing the lives of our beautiful young children. We know that they can be harmed by traumatic practices. They will be, and that this will affect their life opportunity. We know that there is a pipeline from the child protection system to the criminal justice system, and all of this is a failure of reconciliation. It is, it is a failing of a national commitment to closing the gap. It is a major cost to the Australian people, and we must do better. We must do better as a nation than this.
Associate Professor Hannah McGlade, a Noongar human rights academic, thank you very much for your company. I do appreciate your time.